The letter was already sealed. Ida Callahan knew this the moment she saw Harlan Voss walking out of the telegraph office with that slow, satisfied smile crawling across his face like a snake finding shade. He tucked something into the breast pocket of his coat, patted it twice with two thick fingers, and glanced across the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, Colorado, directly at her. He didn't look away. He wanted her to see. He wanted her to understand that he had done something irreversible, something that would cost her everything she had spent 3 years bleeding for. The smile widened just enough to show the gap between his front teeth, and then he turned and walked toward the saloon, unhurried, triumphant, leaving her standing on the wooden boardwalk with her heart hammering so loud she could hear it in her back teeth. Ida did not move for 10 full seconds. Then she moved very fast. She crossed the street in 6 strides, pushed open the door of the telegraph office, and found old Clarence Briggs already straightening papers behind his counter with the guilty, averted eyes of a man who had just done something he wasn't proud of. "What did Harlan Voss send?" she said. Clarence looked at his hands. "Miss Callahan, I can't rightly discuss, Clarence." Her voice was flat and sharp as a blade. "What did he send, and to whom?" The old man swallowed. He was a decent man, more frightened of Voss than he was of principle, but not so far gone that he could look Ida Callahan in the face and pretend the world was fair. He cleared his throat and said, very quietly, "He sent a letter, express courier, addressed to the Federal Land Office in Denver. He paid extra to have it delivered first thing tomorrow morning when the office opens." The floor seemed to tilt under Ida's boots. "What was in the letter, Clarence?" "He dictated it himself, ma'am. Said it was a formal contest of claim. Said there were irregularities in the Callahan land filing. Said the deed had been obtained under fraudulent representation." He finally looked up, and his eyes were miserable. "He filed a challenge to your deed, Miss Callahan. If it reaches Denver before Mr. Rhodes submits the final purchase documentation in the morning, the sale gets frozen, may be voided. The land office won't complete a contested transaction." Ida felt the betrayal move through her like ice water. Because Harlan Voss had been sitting across from her at supper 3 nights ago, all pleasant conversation and false neighborliness, and all along he had been constructing this trap. He had known about the deal with George Rhodes. He had known the timing. He had been watching and waiting and smiling that gap-toothed smile while he built the mechanism to destroy her. She looked at the clock on the wall behind Clarence. It was 8:30 in the evening. The land office in Denver opened at 7 in the morning. Denver was 60 miles north. Ida Callahan walked out of the telegraph office, and she did not walk toward her hotel room. She walked toward the livery stable, and as she walked she was already calculating. Her mare, Sable, was fast but not fast enough for 60 miles in 9 hours over mountain roads. She needed a relay. She needed to think. She needed to not fall apart for the next 30 seconds, which was exactly how long she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what was happening before she locked it down and started solving the problem. She had 3 years of work on the line. She had the only piece of land in the Colorado territory that had belonged to her father, her mother, and now to her. She was not going to let Harlan Voss take it. To understand what was truly at stake on that cold October night in 1878, you have to go back 6 months, to the spring morning when George Rhodes first rode onto the Callahan land with a surveyor's map in his saddlebag, and the careful, quiet manner of a man who had learned not to want things too openly. Redemption Creek sat in a shallow valley between 2 arms of the Rockies, and the Callahan land occupied a wedge of that valley where the creek itself ran clear and reliable even through the driest summers. Ida's father, Patrick Callahan, had filed on that land in 1862 under the Homestead Act, built the house with his own hands, and died of fever in the winter of 1873, leaving Ida, then 24 years old, with a deed, a debt, and 160 acres of the finest grazing land in the county. Her mother had followed Patrick 2 years later, leaving Ida alone in the house she had grown up in, running cattle she could barely afford to winter, fighting the land office every time some clerical error put her deed at risk, fighting the neighbors who thought a woman alone was an invitation. Ida was 29 years old in the spring of 1878, and she had not broken. She had come close. There had been a January 2 years back when the snow came early and stayed late, and she had buried 4 cattle and half her savings in the same month, and she had sat at her kitchen table at midnight with a lamp burning low and seriously considered what it would mean to sell. She had not sold. She had let the thought exist, measured its weight, and then set it aside and gone to bed and gotten up before dawn and kept working. George Rhodes arrived on the 15th of April, which Ida remembered because it was the first genuinely warm day after a punishing winter, and the creek was running high and fast with snowmelt, and she had been out checking the south fence line when she heard hoofbeats and looked up to see a man on a bay gelding picking his way along the creek bank with the careful attention of someone who was actually looking at the land rather than just crossing it. He stopped when he saw her. He had the instinct of a man who understood that appearing suddenly on someone else's property required acknowledgement, not just passage. He pulled up his horse 20 yards away and said, "Morning. I'm looking for the Callahan claim. I believe I may have crossed onto it." "You believe correctly," Ida said. "Who are you?" "George Rhodes. I have a letter of introduction from the First Territorial Bank of Denver." He reached into his coat, extracted an envelope, and held it toward her without moving closer, which she appreciated. He was giving her the choice of closing the distance, not presuming it. She walked her horse over and took the envelope and read the letter. George Rhodes was 32 years old, a former Army surveyor who had left government service 4 years earlier to work land acquisition for the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad. The railroad was expanding its line south through the territory, and it needed water. Specifically, it needed reliable water access for the steam engines it planned to run through the mountain passes, and the Callahan Creek was exactly what their engineers had identified as the most viable source for a pumping station. The bank letter confirmed he was authorized to make a legitimate offer for either purchase of the land or a permanent water easement, whichever the current owner preferred. Ida handed the letter back without a word and looked at him. George Rhodes was not what she had expected from a railroad man. He was broad-shouldered in an understated way, not bulky but built, with the kind of physical steadiness that comes from years of outdoor work rather than cultivation. His face was angular, a little weathered, with dark eyes that were paying close attention to everything around them in the methodical way of a man trained to read terrain. He wore his hat pushed back slightly, which she later learned was a habit, that he never wore it fully forward because he didn't like anything limiting his peripheral vision. He had a small scar along his jaw that she didn't ask about for 3 weeks. "How much?" she said. "That depends on what you're willing to accept," he said. "And what you're willing to part with." "I'm not parting with the land." "Then we're talking about an easement." "Tell me what that means in practice," she said, because she was not going to pretend to know something she didn't, not when the stakes were this high. He told her. He had a direct, thorough way of explaining things that didn't condescend, and he drew a rough map in the dirt with a stick while he talked, showing her exactly where the railroad intended to run its line, where the pumping station would sit, what the construction would disturb, and what it would leave alone. He was honest about the disruption. He told her the construction crew would be on the land for 6 to 8 weeks, that there would be noise and machinery and a temporary camp, that a strip of 20 yards along the creek's east bank would need to be cleared, but that the grazing land above the creek would remain entirely hers, and the easement would apply only to water rights, not surface use. Ida listened to all of it without interrupting, which George Rhodes later told her was the moment he had started to understand that she was serious in a way that required him to be equally serious in return. "Come back Friday," she said. "I need to look over the survey maps myself and talk to a lawyer." "Of course," he said. He gathered his stick map and started to wheel his horse. "Mr. Rhodes," she said, He turned. "If I find anything in those maps that doesn't match what you've just told me, we're done negotiating." He looked at her steadily. "Miss Callahan, if you find anything in those maps that doesn't match what I've told you, you'll be right to walk away." He rode out, and Ida stood by the fence for a long moment watching him go, and she thought, almost against her will, that she had just met one of the most straightforwardly honest people she had encountered in a very long time. She didn't trust it. She had been fooled before, but she noted it. Friday came, and George Rhodes came back, and this time they sat at the kitchen table she had shared with her parents and spread the railroad survey maps across the oilcloth, and she went through them line by line with the careful precision of a woman who had spent years learning to read every document that touched her land, because no one else was going to do it for her. She had borrowed 2 law books from the county clerk's office, and she had spent Thursday night memorizing the relevant sections on easement law. George watched her work through the maps and said nothing, just answered her questions when she asked them, and once, when she caught a discrepancy between the map's elevation markers and her own knowledge of the creek's flood plain, he pulled out his survey notebook and confirmed that she was correct and noted the discrepancy in his records without being defensive about it. "Your engineers made an error," she said flatly. "Yes," he said, "and now we've corrected it. Thank you." She looked up at him from across the table, and for a moment the professional formality between them thinned into something more personal, because she had expected resistance or condescension or a man who would smile and ignore what she said, and instead she got someone who simply accepted that she was right and moved forward accordingly. It was so rare that it caught her off guard. "More coffee," she said. "Please," he said. That was the beginning of it, though neither of them would have called it that for a long time. Through April and into May, George came to the Callahan land every Friday to go over the next stage of the easement negotiations. The railroad company was slow in processing its own paperwork, which meant the meetings stretched on week after week. And after the third one, Ida began making lunch, because it seemed wasteful not to. And by the 6th meeting, they were sitting across from each other at her kitchen table eating beans and cornbread, and discussing things that had nothing to do with easements. She learned that he had grown up in Ohio, had come west at 19 to join the Army Surveyors, had seen a great deal of the territory that most people never would, and had developed a complicated relationship with the railroad that employed him, respecting its ambitions and distrusting its methods in roughly equal measure. He had a younger sister in Cincinnati, who wrote him letters every month that he answered faithfully, and a deep fondness for the mountains that he expressed with the understated intensity of someone who had never learned how to be effusive about the things that mattered most to him. She told him about her father and the land, about her mother's death, about the years of managing alone. She did not tell him everything. There were parts of the story she kept back, not because she was hiding them exactly, but because she wasn't sure yet if he had earned them. He had a habit of going still when she was talking about something important, a kind of focused attentiveness that was so complete it could feel almost unnerving until you understood that it was not judgment. It was simply him listening with everything he had. She had never been listened to like that before. She had not known what to do with it at first. She had kept talking partly because the quality of his attention made her feel that what she was saying was worth hearing. By June, they had agreed on the terms of the easement in principle, pending the railroad's final authorization. The formal deal was 6 months away, with the contract scheduled to be signed and submitted to the Federal Land Office before the end of October. The timing was specific because the railroad's construction schedule required a start date before the winter made the ground impassable, and the land office had a specific calendar for processing new easements in the territory. In the months between June and October, George Rhodes found reasons to be in Redemption Creek more often than the easement negotiations strictly required. Ida found reasons to accommodate this. She was not naive about what was happening between them, but she was cautious with it in the way she was cautious with everything that mattered, treating it carefully, not speaking about it directly, letting it exist in the spaces between practical conversations without yet giving it a name. She had been let down before by people who had seemed trustworthy and turned out to be motivated by the land, by the water rights, by her father's name on a deed. She carried that history with the pragmatic wariness of a woman who had learned the hard way that wanting to trust someone was not the same as having evidence that they deserved it. George did not push. He had his own history, his own reasons for moving carefully, which she didn't know yet. He came, he was present. He helped when she needed help in the uncomplicated way of a man who doesn't perform generosity but simply acts. He rode back to his rooms at the hotel in town each time, and he never made her feel that the space between them was a problem that needed solving. What changed things was the afternoon in late August when a sudden storm rolled down from the mountains faster than either of them had anticipated, and they were caught in the south field checking the fence line she had been meaning to repair for a week. The rain came in sheets, cold and hard, and they ran the horses to the barn and stood inside while the storm hammered the roof and lightning cracked across the ridge. And the barn was warm and close and smelled of hay and horses and rain on old wood. They were standing close together, not by intention, but by the simple physics of two people taking shelter in a space made smaller by the things it already contained. Ida was wringing water from her braid with both hands, and she looked up to say something practical about the fence and found George looking at her with an expression that was not professional or careful or appropriate to the terms of their agreement, and the thing that had been living unnamed between them for months suddenly had nowhere left to hide. "Ida," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. He had called her Miss Callahan through all the weeks of negotiation and lunch and long, quiet afternoons at her kitchen table, and the simplicity of it, the way he said it like it was a word he had been practicing and was finally sure enough of to say aloud, did something to her chest that she was not prepared for. She did not say anything. She looked at him for a long moment in the sound of the rain, and then she closed the distance between them herself, because she was Ida Callahan and she had never in her life waited for someone else to make the first move when she was already sure of something, and she was sure of this. She kissed him first. He kissed her back with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, complete and unhurried and deeply present, and the rain came down on the roof, and the horses shifted in their stalls, and something inside Ida that had been locked for a very long time quietly came open. They stood apart after a moment, both of them slightly startled by the force of what had just happened, and George said with a rough kind of care, "I need you to know that this has nothing to do with the easement." "I know," she said. "I need you to be sure," he said. "Because the easement is real and the deal is real, and I don't want you to ever have reason to question whether I came here for the land or for you." Ida looked at him steadily. "George, I'm the one who just kissed you." He looked at her for a moment and then he laughed, a low, real laugh that she had never heard from him before, and she thought that it was possibly the best sound she had heard in years. "You did," he said. "The fence still needs fixing," she said. "It does," he agreed. They fixed the fence after the storm passed, but something had fundamentally shifted, and both of them knew it. What came after was the best 2 months of Ida's life, and she had not fully understood how much she needed it to be good until it was. George was not a demonstrative man in the public sense. He did not make declarations or perform affection for an audience. But in private, in the quiet of her kitchen or the long light of late summer evenings on the porch, he was warm in a way that was all the more striking for how contained he was otherwise. He remembered small things she had said weeks earlier. He brought her books from Denver when he made trips for railroad business. He fixed the loose step on her porch stairs without being asked, just noticed it was loose and fixed it the next morning before she was up. He argued with her when he disagreed, directly and without apology, which she respected profoundly because the alternative, a man who deferred to everything she said to avoid conflict, would have been infinitely worse. He told her about the scar on his jaw one evening in September, sitting on the porch watching the sun go behind the mountains. He had gotten it 3 years earlier, in a dispute over a land survey in New Mexico territory, from a man who had not wanted the survey done, because it would have revealed that he had built his ranch house 6 yards over his property line. The dispute had escalated in the manner of disputes in the territory in those years, and George had ended up with a knife across his jaw and a marshal's summons he had to spend 2 weeks testifying at. The man who had cut him had gone to jail for assault, but George said this without satisfaction, said it in the tone of a man who was still not entirely sure the outcome had been worth what it cost. Ida told him, the following week, about the man she had almost married in 1875. His name had been Daniel Cross, and he had been charming in the way that only becomes visible as manipulation in retrospect, when you can see the shape of all the things he had wanted and trace the route he had taken to get them. He had courted her for 8 months and proposed in the spring, and she had said yes because she was lonely and the land was hard, and he had said all the right things. She had discovered 3 weeks before the wedding that he had already filed paperwork with the county recorder to add his name to the deed of the Callahan land using a legal provision that would have given a husband joint ownership upon marriage. He had not told her. He had not discussed it. He had simply done it, quietly, banking on her not finding out until after the ceremony. She had found out. She had called off the wedding. She had spent 6 months afterward processing the specific kind of grief that comes not from lost love, but from the discovery that you were loved by no one, that what you had taken for affection was only a strategy. George listened to this without speaking, with his familiar quality of complete attention, and when she finished he said, "He was a fool and a coward, and you did the right thing." "I know," she said, "but I've been careful since then." "I know you have," he said. He reached across the porch rail and took her hand. "So have I." They sat in the darkening evening holding hands, and Ida thought that whatever this was, it was real, and she was going to fight for it the way she fought for everything she valued. Then October came. The formal contract, the one that would transfer the permanent water easement from the Callahan deed to the railroad company in exchange for a sum that would clear Ida's debt and leave her with money to properly winter her cattle and repair the barn roof that had been leaking for 2 seasons, was scheduled to be signed on the 15th of October. George had the railroad's authorization papers. The land office in Denver had the filing on its calendar. Everything was in order. Everything was aligned. Harlan Voss had watched all of it. Voss owned the Voss Ranch, which lay along the valley's north ridge, and had always coveted the creek access that the Callahan land controlled. He was a man who had accumulated property over 2 decades by methods that ranged from legally questionable to unambiguously predatory, and he had tried 3 times in the previous 10 years to pressure Ida into selling, each time through a slightly different approach, an offer that was insulting in its lowness. A rumor circulated at the feed store about deed irregularities that she had to spend money on a lawyer to disprove. A fence that mysteriously moved 6 yards in the direction of her property one spring and had to be surveyed and relocated at her expense. She had defeated all 3 approaches. Voss had responded to each defeat with the patient malice of a man who believed, with absolute certainty, that persistence was the same as eventual victory. When he learned about the railroad deal, he recognized immediately that the water easement would permanently remove the creek from his sphere of influence. If the railroad had legal claim to the water rights in perpetuity, Voss could never leverage the creek access as a reason to control the Callahan land. The deal was not just a financial transaction. It was, from Voss's perspective, a permanent strategic defeat. He had thought about it for 6 months while pretending to be a civil neighbor. He had come to Ida's table 3 nights before the signing, all pleasant conversation and false neighborliness, and he had watched her, and he had seen in her eyes a kind of happiness she had not had before, the particular brightness that comes from a life that is finally moving in the right direction, and it had confirmed for him that the deal was real, and that the moment to act was almost past. He had dictated the letter to Clarence Briggs that same night. The letter was a formal contest of claim filed under federal land law. alleging that the original Callahan homestead filing in 1862 had included a fraudulent boundary description that gave the Callahan family 43 acres of adjacent federal land without legal authorization. This was a fabrication, but it was a plausible fabrication, rooted in the genuine complexity of the original land surveys from the 1860s when the Homestead Act was new, and the boundary descriptions were often imprecise. Voss had paid a man in Denver, a disgraced former land office clerk named Silas Prout, who knew exactly how the federal filing system worked, to construct the contest in language that would be taken seriously enough to freeze the Callahan deed pending review. A frozen deed could not be used as the basis for an easement transfer. If the letter reached the land office before George Rhodes submitted the easement contract in the morning, the transaction would be automatically suspended for a period of 30 to 90 days while the contest was investigated. By the time it was resolved, the railroad's construction window would have passed, and they would look elsewhere for water access, and the deal would be dead, and Ida would be back where she started. Voss knew this. Clarence Briggs knew this. And now Ida Callahan knew this, standing in the livery stable at 8:30 in the evening, her hands on Sable's neck, doing the mathematics of survival. 60 miles to Denver. 9.5 hours until the land office opened. Mountain roads in the dark in October, when the temperatures dropped hard after midnight and the passes got ice on them before dawn. She could not do 60 miles alone on Sable in that time. The horse would founder. She needed a relay, which meant she needed another horse. She needed someone who had a horse she could borrow at the halfway point. She needed someone she trusted completely, which narrowed the field considerably. She was thinking through the names when the livery door opened and George Rhodes walked in. He read her face in about 2 seconds because that was how long it took him, and he said, "What happened?" she told him. She told him fast and without softening any of it, and she watched his face move through several expressions in quick succession: anger, recognition, and then a kind of fierce, organized calm that she had come to associate with him when he was solving a serious problem. "The letter goes out first thing tomorrow morning by express courier," he said. "Yes. And we have to get to the land office before the courier does." "Yes." He was already moving. He pulled his gelding Cedar from the stall and started saddling him with the efficient speed of a man who had saddled horses in the dark under worse circumstances. "I know the mountain road. I did survey work through that pass 2 years ago. If we ride hard to Halfway Creek, there's a relay station. Tom Briggs runs it. He and Clarence are cousins, but Tom has no loyalty to Voss that I know of, and he has fast horses. We can exchange mounts there and push through to Denver." Ida was already saddling Sable. "I know Tom Briggs. He helped me 3 winters ago when the creek froze and I lost a calf in the ice. He won't turn us away." "Then we go." George paused, looking at her across the saddle. In the lamplight of the livery, his eyes were very dark and very serious. "Ida, I want you to understand something before we ride." "George, we don't have time. This will take 10 seconds, he said. "I came here 6 months ago to negotiate a business transaction. That is still true. But what I am doing right now has nothing to do with the railroad, and nothing to do with the easement. I am riding 60 miles through the mountains in the dark because this is your land and your father's land, and you have earned it 3 times over, and Harlan Voss is a predator, and I will be damned if I let him win this." Ida looked at him across the dim space of the livery, and she felt something crack open in her chest, not painfully, the way things break, but the way sealed things open when they finally find the right moment. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "Thank me when we're standing in that land office at 7 in the morning." They rode out of Redemption Creek at 8:45, heading north into the dark. The mountain road north to Denver was not a simple road. It climbed through 2 passes, one at 6,200 feet and one at 7,400, and in October after sundown, the temperature dropped 20 degrees from the valley floor to the higher elevations. Ida had ridden this road before, twice in daylight, once in a wagon that had gone slowly and carefully over the rocky sections. She had not ridden it at speed in the dark. She trusted Sable's footing, and she trusted the moonlight, which was full or close enough to full that the road was visible as a pale track between the darker shapes of the pines. George rode slightly ahead, not from habit of leadership, but because he genuinely knew the road better, had surveyed it, had maps of it in his memory, and he called back warnings at the bad sections, a loose stretch of shale at the first switchback, a narrow point above a drop where the road narrowed to barely a horse width, a section where a small rockfall from the previous spring had never been cleared, and they had to pick their way around the boulders at a walk. They did not talk much on the road, because conversation at a gallop is difficult, and they needed their attention on the terrain. But there were stretches of smoother road through the valley between the two passes where they could ride together at a steady canter, and in those stretches they talked, not about the land office or the letter or Voss, but about other things, the things you talk about when you are in a dark moment and need to remember that there is a world beyond it. He told her about the first time he had seen the Rockies, 19 years old and having grown up in Ohio, which was flat in every direction, and the mountains had hit him like a physical revelation, like being shown something he had not known to want and realizing immediately that he could not do without it. She told him about the spring her father had taken her to the top of the ridge above their land when she was 12 years old and shown her the full valley spread below them, the creek a silver line through the green, and told her that this was hers, that it had always been hers, and that no one would ever be able to take it from her as long as she was willing to fight for it. She had believed him. She still believed him. But there had been times when believing required the particular effort of a person fighting against evidence. "It's yours," George said, in the dark, at a canter. "We're going to make sure of it tonight." At Halfway Creek, Tom Briggs was already awake, as relay station operators often were in the territory, keeping odd hours by necessity. He was a broad man in his 50s, weathered and deliberate, and he knew Ida Callahan immediately and shook her hand and asked no unnecessary questions when she and George explained what they needed. He led 2 fresh horses out himself, a big roan for George and a quick-footed buckskin for Ida, and he let them leave their horses in his corral and told them he would hold them safely. "Voss been trouble long as I can remember," Tom said, as they were mounting. "You go stop that letter." "We intend to," Ida said. The buckskin was faster than Sable, which helped on the second half of the journey. The second pass was the harder one, steeper and more exposed, and the cold was serious by then, the kind of cold that finds the gaps in your coat and settles in your joints. Ida rode through it with the focus of someone who has decided that physical discomfort is simply not allowed to be the relevant consideration at this moment. She had grown up in these mountains. She had worked cattle in weather that would have stopped most men. She was not going to let cold stop her. George glanced back at her regularly, not from doubt in her capability. She had made clear early in their acquaintance that she would tell him if she needed help, and he did not need to anticipate it, but from something more fundamental than doubt, from the particular attentiveness of a man who had found something he valued enormously and was constitutionally incapable of not monitoring its safety. She caught him looking once on a flat stretch in the dark and shouted across the wind, "Stop watching me and watch the road." "I can do both," he shouted back. "You'll miss the shale." He navigated the shale section flawlessly, guiding the roan around it with the ease of someone who had expected it, and gave her a look over his shoulder that she could see even in the moonlight was insufferably satisfied. And despite everything, despite the cold and the urgency and the deep anger at Harlan Voss that had been fueling her for the past 3 hours, she laughed. It was a short laugh, clipped by the wind, but it was real, and George heard it, and something in the set of his shoulders eased. They came down out of the second pass at 3 in the morning and began the long approach to Denver through the Piedmont, where the road was flatter and better maintained, and they could push the horses to a real run. The city was visible well before they reached it, the lights of gas lamps in a cluster of amber in the darkness of the plain, and Ida felt the specific quality of desperate hope that comes when you can see the destination and are still calculating whether you will reach it in time. They reached the outskirts of Denver at 20 past 4 in the morning. The federal land office opened at 7, which meant they had 2 hours and 40 minutes to wait, which was both a relief and a new kind of torment. George found a livery in the city for the borrowed horses, and then found a small restaurant near the government buildings that was already open, run by a woman who started her stove at 4 in the morning, because there was always someone in Denver who needed coffee and food before the sun was up. Ida and George sat at a corner table and drank coffee that was strong and hot and excellent, and ate eggs and bread that the woman brought without being asked, because she took one look at them and recognized 2 people who had been riding hard through the night and needed feeding. Ida's hands were cold enough that she had to wrap them around the coffee cup before she could fully feel her fingers. George watched her do this, and then reached across the table and took her hands in both of his, cupping them against the warmth of his palms, and held them until the feeling came back. She looked at him across the table in the early morning lamp light of the restaurant, both of them trail dusty and tired, and she thought that she had been right to be careful for so long, because being careful was what had made it possible to recognize the real thing when it arrived. "George," she said. He looked at her. "When this is over," she said, "I would like to discuss something that has nothing to do with easements or land offices or Harlan Voss." Something moved through his eyes, careful and warm and serious all at once. "I would very much like that," he said. They waited. They drank more coffee. The restaurant filled gradually with the earliest risers of the city, clerks and laborers, and a few officials who lived nearby and walked to their offices, and the sky through the window shifted from black to dark blue to the pale gray of approaching dawn. At 7:15, Ida and George walked to the federal land office. At 10 minutes to 7, they were standing at the entrance when the office clerk arrived to unlock the door. At 7 o'clock precisely, they were inside, and at 7 minutes past 7, the express courier arrived with Harlan Voss's letter. The land office clerk, a young man named Fletcher who took his job with the humorless precision of someone who believed that paperwork was the last line of defense against chaos, looked at the courier, looked at the letter, looked at Ida and George who were standing at his window with the easement contract already submitted, stamped, and logged, and said, with no expression at all, "This matter is already registered. The Callahan deed has been processed in connection with the easement transfer filed at 7:03 this morning. A contest filed against a deed that has already been incorporated into a completed registered transaction requires a separate legal proceeding and cannot halt a transaction that is already recorded. You'll need to file this through the courts." He slid the letter back through the window to the courier without opening it. The courier, who had no personal stake in any of this, shrugged, tucked the letter under his arm, and left. Ida Callahan stood very still for about 5 seconds, feeling the full weight of the past 10 hours process through her body all at once, the cold and the riding and the fear and the anger and the desperate mathematical calculation of roads and time, and then she exhaled a breath she felt like she had been holding for 6 months. George Rhodes stood beside her, close enough that his arm was against hers, and he said very quietly, "It's done." "It's done," she said. Fletcher, the clerk, was already filing the paperwork with the methodical efficiency of a man who had returned to his natural habitat. Ida turned to George, and George was looking at her with that expression she had first seen in the barn in the rain in August, the one that had changed things, and she thought that they had ridden 60 miles in the dark to save her land, and they had made it, and the land was hers, and the deal was real, and standing in a federal building in Denver at 7 in the morning covered in trail dust was possibly the most unlikely setting for what she was feeling, which was something enormous and clean and sure. "You said earlier," George said, That you wanted to discuss something that had nothing to do with the land office. I did, she said. I have something I'd like to say first if you'll allow it. She nodded. He was quiet for a moment, gathering it, in the way he gathered anything important, with care and without rushing. Fletcher was pretending to find something urgent on the other side of the room. I came to Redemption Creek in April to make a deal for a railroad company, George said. And I'm standing here in October having ridden 60 miles through a mountain pass in the dark. And the thing I keep thinking about is not the easement or the railroad or any of it. I keep thinking that I have spent my whole adult life surveying land and assessing value, and I have never in all of that time been more certain of anything than I am certain of you. I know the timing is not arranged perfectly. I know we are standing in a government office, and you are tired and cold, and we both smell of horse. But I mean what I'm about to say, and I don't want to wait for a better moment, because I've spent years waiting for better moments, and I have learned that the moment is always the one you're in. Ida looked at him. Fletcher had found something very compelling to look at on the ceiling. I love you, George said, with the plain directness of a man who has decided that the most important things deserve the simplest words. I would like, if it is what you want, to build a life with you, to stay, to be on that land and in that kitchen and on that porch for the rest of whatever time I get. Not because of the easement, not because of the railroad, but because you are the most extraordinary person I have ever met, and I do not want to go one more week pretending that the specific terms of a water rights agreement are the primary reason I keep showing up. Fletcher coughed quietly and slid a form across his counter to no one. Ida Callahan, who had been alone on 160 acres for 5 years and had fought for every inch of them, and had learned to be self-sufficient in the particular way that can sometimes calcify into isolation if you let it, who had been let down and deceived, and had learned caution the hard way, who had kissed George Rhodes first in a barn in a rainstorm because she was Ida Callahan, and she did not wait when she was sure. Looked at this man who had ridden through the night beside her and said exactly what she knew to be true. I love you too, she said, and yes, stay. He reached up and touched her face with one hand, trail dusty and work rough, and she turned her face into his palm for a moment, and then he kissed her, right there in the Federal Land Office in Denver, Colorado, in October of 1878, with Fletcher ostentatiously reviewing something on the far end of the counter. When they separated, Fletcher said, without looking up, "Congratulations on the successful registration." "Thank you, Fletcher," Ida said. They walked out into the morning, which had gone from gray to gold while they were inside, the sun coming up behind the mountains and throwing long bright lines across the city streets. Denver was waking up around them, wagons and horses and the sound of the city's daily commerce beginning, and they stood on the steps of the land office in the morning light, still dusty, still tired. And Ida thought that this was what it felt like when things went right. Not the absence of hardship, but the presence of someone beside you who had been willing to ride through it. The ride back to Redemption Creek took 2.5 days, because they returned at a pace the horses could sustain, and because there was no longer any urgency requiring otherwise. They stopped again at Tom Briggs's relay station, where Ida told him the letter had been stopped and the deal was done, and Tom shook both their hands with the satisfied air of a man who enjoyed seeing justice correctly administered, and sent them off with their own horses and a package of cornbread his wife had wrapped for the road. They rode through the mountains in daylight this time, and the mountains were extraordinary in October, the aspens gold and the sky that particular shade of blue that exists only at altitude, and they talked for hours, the practical and the profound mixed together in the easy way of two people who have moved past the point of performing for each other. George told her more about his sister in Cincinnati. He told her about his plans, the things he wanted to do when he was no longer working for the railroad, a thought he had been cultivating quietly for the past year, which was to start his own land surveying practice in the territory, independent, working for individual landowners rather than corporations, because he believed that the individual landowners, the people who had come to this country to build something of their own, deserved accurate surveying as much as any railroad. Ida listened to this and thought about what she knew about the county's needs for accurate survey work, which was substantial, and began thinking about how a surveying practice and a working cattle ranch with water rights might complement each other rather than compete. "You'd need an office," she said. "I would. The barn has a storage room in the back that I've never found a good use for. It's dry and well framed. You could build out a workspace in it." George was quiet for a moment. "That would put my office on your property." "Yes," she said, "that would be the general idea." He looked at her sideways from across the road. "Ida Callahan, are you suggesting a practical arrangement, or are you suggesting something more comprehensive than that?" "George Rhodes, I am suggesting," she said, "that when two people have agreed to build a life together, they ought to be practical about the infrastructure." He laughed, that low, real laugh, and reached across the road between them and took her hand, and they rode the last miles to Redemption Creek in the afternoon sun, with their hands bridging the space between their horses. The matter of Harlan Voss was not finished, of course. Voss received news of the blocked letter within a day, through the same network of informants that had kept him abreast of the deal in the first place. Ida heard through the county seat that he had thrown a chair in his ranch house upon receiving the news, which she considered a satisfying image. More practically, he had Silas Pruitt's fraudulent contest of claims still in hand, and 2 days after their return from Denver, Ida found a formal notice on her door indicating that the contest had been refiled through the district court. The court filing was different from the land office letter. It required a legal response rather than a physical intervention. George was the one who said, calmly and without panic, "Then we respond legally." He rode to the county seat and hired the best land attorney in the territory, a woman named Margaret Forsyth who had practiced law in Denver before moving to Redemption Creek 3 years earlier, and who had been fighting the kind of fraudulent land contest that Voss had manufactured for her entire career. Margaret Forsyth was 42 years old, with a face like a hawk and a legal mind like a steel trap, and she looked at the contest filing for approximately 10 minutes, and then looked up with the specific expression of a person who has been handed exactly the kind of fight they have been looking for. "This is constructed by someone who knows the system," Margaret said, "but it has 3 errors in the boundary description that contradict the original 1862 survey record, which I have copies of. Voss's man, whoever drafted this, did not account for the 1864 boundary clarification that your father filed when there was a question about the eastern edge. Your father was thorough, Miss Callahan. That clarification filing is what kills this contest." "My father was very thorough," Ida said, and felt the grief and pride of it in equal measure. Margaret Forsyth filed the response within the week, and the court proceedings ran through November and into December, during which time Ida went about her life and her work with the particular equanimity of a woman who has done what can be done and is not going to dissolve in waiting. George had been as good as his word. He stayed. He had given formal notice to the railroad that he would not be renewing his contract at the year's end, and he had begun the paperwork for his independent surveying practice with the same methodical care he brought to everything. He stayed at the hotel in town while the legal question was pending, because they were both aware that the community watched and that there was a shape to things that mattered for practical reasons. But he came to the Callahan land every day and worked, and they ate at her kitchen table, and in the evenings they sat on the porch where the step was still perfectly repaired from his attention months ago, and they talked about the future with the careful seriousness of two people who intended to be in it together for a long time. George asked her to marry him on a Thursday evening in late November, sitting on the porch with the first real snow of the season coming down around them, soft and quiet, and making the land strange and beautiful. He did not produce a ring because he had not known he was going to ask tonight specifically. It had simply arrived as the right moment in the way that right moments sometimes do when you stop managing them, and he asked her with the same directness he had brought to everything he had ever said to her, clearly and without hedging. She said yes without hesitation. "I don't have a ring yet," he said. "I am aware," she said. "I'll get one. George, I own 160 acres of the finest grazing land in the county with a railroad water easement attached to it, and a legal challenge that is going to be defeated inside of a month. A ring can wait." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him in the falling snow, and they sat like that while the ranch went white and quiet around them. And Ida thought that she had fought for this land for so long, and now she was sitting on it with someone who loved her on it, and the fighting had been worth it. The court decision came down on the 14th of December, 3 weeks before Christmas. The district court found the contest of claim to be without merit, dismissed it in its entirety, and noted in its written decision that the boundary descriptions in the filing contained material inaccuracies that contradicted the existing public record. Margaret Forsythe appeared at Ida's door with the notice the same afternoon it was issued, because she had been waiting for it with her hawk eyes and her steel-trap mind, and she handed it over with a satisfaction that was barely contained behind professional composure. Ida read the decision twice, carefully, all the way through to the final dismissal language, and then she set it on the kitchen table and sat down and was quiet for a moment. Margaret Forsythe, who understood what 3 years of fighting looked like when it was finally over, said nothing, and poured herself coffee from the pot on the stove and sat across the table and let the quiet be what it needed to be. George was outside doing fence work when Ida came out of the house. He looked at her face and set down the fence tool. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. He crossed the yard and she walked to meet him, and they held each other in the cold December light with the snow on the mountains above them and the creek running clear below the house. And the land was quiet and whole and hers, uncontested, permanent, safe. Harlan Voss left Redemption Creek in January of 1879, quietly and without announcement, selling his ranch to a family from Kansas through a Denver broker. Ida heard about it from Tom Briggs's cousin at the feed store, and she received the news with the complicated feeling of someone who has spent years fighting a person, and finds that their departure is not a triumph so much as a removal of a long-standing weight. She did not celebrate. She filed it away and went on with her day. They married in February, in the small church in Redemption Creek on a Saturday afternoon, with Tom Briggs and his wife attending, and Margaret Forsythe, and Clarence Briggs, who came with his hat in his hands and his guilty eyes, and whom Ida had decided to forgive because he was an essentially decent man who had made a cowardly choice, and who was going to have to live with knowing that for the rest of his life, and that was enough. The minister was a compact man who performed the ceremony with brisk sincerity, and it was short and cold and perfect. George had gotten the ring, a simple gold band with a small set garnet, the color of the creek in autumn, and when he put it on her finger in the church she looked at it and thought that it was exactly right, not elaborate, not performing, just real and lasting. They rode home to the Callahan land in the February cold, and when they got there George unhitched the horses and Ida made coffee, and they sat at the kitchen table that had been her parents' table, and had hosted 6 months of easement negotiations, and 100 quiet conversations, and the whole slow architecture of a love built out of honesty and attention and trust. And they drank their coffee in the late afternoon light with the snow coming in at the windows, and Ida thought, "This is it. This is the thing I was fighting for, not just the land, this." Spring came in March with the force it always had in the mountains, snow and mud, and the creek running high and cold, and the first green showing on the south-facing slopes. George's surveying practice had begun to take clients before winter was fully over, word having spread through the county that there was a precise and honest land surveyor available for reasonable rates, and he had 3 contracts in hand before the ground thawed enough to work. He set up his workspace in the back room of the barn exactly as Ida had suggested, with a drafting table he had ordered from Denver and good oil lamps for the detail work. And she sometimes stood in the doorway watching him work in the mornings, bent over a map with his hat pushed back, and felt such a fullness of feeling about the life they were building that she had no adequate words for it. She didn't always need words. She would bring him coffee and set it beside the drafting table, and he would look up and say thank you with the kind of smile that was just for her, the one he didn't deploy in public or professional settings, the one that was warm all the way through, and she would go back to her own work and carry it with her through the morning. They planted a kitchen garden in April, which was partly practical and partly the act of people who were putting down roots in the particular way of those who intend to be somewhere for a very long time. Ida had never had a kitchen garden before. The land had always been cattle land, but George's mother had kept one in Ohio, and he knew what he was doing with seeds and soil, and they worked it together in the evenings after their separate days were done, side by side in the dirt with the mountains going orange and pink above them. By summer, the garden was producing, and the railroad's pumping station had been completed along the east bank of the creek per the easement terms, and the construction crew was gone, and the land had largely healed itself over the disturbed strip, and the payment from the easement had cleared every debt the Callahan land carried and left money besides. Ida had a new barn roof. She had wintered cattle that were fat going into the next season. She had a kitchen garden and a surveying husband and a kitchen table that was full of conversation most evenings. In the autumn of 1879, Ida told George she was pregnant. She told him matter-of-factly, at the kitchen table, because that was where they had always had the serious conversations, and it seemed right. She told him and watched his face, and watched the comprehension move through him, and then something else, something that turned his careful, angular face completely open in a way she had only seen a handful of times, and he was around the table before she had finished the sentence. Their son was born in April of 1880, in the same month of the same year that George had first ridden onto the Callahan land 3 years earlier. They named him Patrick, for Ida's father, who had built the land and left it to her and told her it would always be hers. Patrick came into the world with the particular healthy insistence of a child who has no intention of being ignored, and he was furious about being born until he wasn't, and then he was wide-eyed and interested in everything, which was how he remained. They put a cradle in the kitchen, near the stove where it was warm, and in the evenings when the day's work was done and the light was low and Patrick was asleep in his cradle, Ida and George sat at the kitchen table and sometimes talked and sometimes didn't, and the quiet was as companionable as the conversation. George's surveying practice grew steadily through 1880 and into 1881. He had taken on a young assistant named Henry Wheeler, a 20-year-old from Pueblo with a good mathematical mind, and an eagerness to learn that reminded George of himself at 19, and he taught him the trade with the same thoroughness and honesty he brought to everything. Henry became a regular presence at the ranch, eating at the kitchen table with the natural ease of someone who has been made genuinely welcome, and Ida found she liked having people at the table, having the house full. She had been alone in it for too long. The fullness suited her. Patrick learned to walk in the spring of 1881. Just ahead of schedule and with absolute determination, pulling himself upright along the kitchen furniture, and then launching himself across the floor with an expression of total concentration that made George laugh every single time. He had George's dark eyes and Ida's red-gold hair, and the particular combination of stubbornness and thoughtfulness that was the inheritance of both of his parents. In the summer of 1881, Ida rode out to check the south fence line, which still required attention each season, and sat her horse on the ridge above the valley and looked down at the full shape of the land below her. The creek ran clear through the valley. The pumping station sat quiet and functional along the east bank. The cattle were spread across the upper pastures in the August heat, and below the house she could see the kitchen garden, still producing, and the barn with George's drafting room in the back where she knew he was working on a survey contract for a family new to the county. The house itself sat solid and weathered and right, exactly where her father had built it, the smoke going up from the chimney even in summer because there was always something cooking. This was the land. This was hers and his and Patrick's and whoever else might come. She sat there for a long time, feeling the full scope of the thing she had held onto, the weight of the years she had fought for this view, and then she turned her horse and rode back down. George was coming out of the barn when she arrived, pushing his hat back in that way he had, squinting at her in the summer light. "Good ride," he said. "Yes," she said. She dismounted and handed him the reins, and as he took them she held his hand for a moment. "George, I have something to tell you." He read her face. He was very good at reading her face. His smile came slowly, the real one, the one that was warm all the way through. "Is that so?" he said. "It is," she said. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. He pulled her in and held her with the horse shifting contentedly beside them in the summer afternoon, and she put her face against his neck and felt his arms around her and the land around both of them, solid and permanent and one. Their daughter was born in the spring of 1882, with red hair like her mother and an opinion about everything that was immediately apparent. They named her Clara, and Patrick, who was 2 years old and very serious about his status as elder, examined her in the cradle with the focused assessment of a small person trying to determine what this new development meant for his established circumstances. It meant, as it turned out, that he had a companion who would keep pace with him in everything, who would follow him across the ranch on her small determined legs the moment she was able, who would argue with him from the time she could form sentences, and who would be his fiercest ally in the same breath, and who would grow up as he did to consider 160 acres of mountain valley in Colorado as the whole and sufficient world. George finished his 4th year of independent surveying in 1882 with a client list that extended to 3 counties and a reputation for accuracy and honesty that was, in the territory, rare enough to be valuable. He had helped Margaret Forsyth on 2 separate cases where fraudulent surveys had been used to contest homestead claims, and those cases had been won, and the families who had almost lost their land had kept it, and George had refused the extra payment they tried to give him for the beyond contract work, which had not surprised Ida at all but had surprised the families considerably. They expanded the house in the autumn of 1882, adding 2 rooms on the east side that caught the morning sun, which George designed with the surveyor's attention to proportion and Ida built with the ranch owner's attention to what was actually functional. And the 2 approaches combined into something that was both better looking and more practical than either would have been alone. Henry Wheeler helped with the construction on weekends, and Tom Briggs came down from the relay station with 2 of his sons, and it was loud and good, and at the end of it the house was bigger and warmer and still recognizably the same house Patrick Callahan had built with his own hands in 1862. Ida walked through the new rooms on the first night after they were finished, running her hand along the new plaster walls and the window frames that George had measured and set with the precision of a man who believed that true things should also be well made. And she thought about her father building this house with his own hands in 1862 and leaving it to her and telling her it would always be hers. It was hers, more than hers. It was theirs, and it was growing, and it would keep growing for as long as they were in it and after. She found George in the new east room, standing at the window looking out at the dark where the creek was a sound rather than a sight, and she came and stood beside him. "Your father would have approved, I think," he said quietly. "He would have liked you," she said. "He valued honest men. High standard. He would have thought you met it." They stood at the window together in the dark of the new room that smelled of fresh plaster and cut timber, and outside the creek ran over its stones, and the mountains were black shapes against a sky full of stars, and the land was quiet and whole and permanent. George put his arm around her and she leaned into him, the same way she had leaned into him on the porch in the February snow the night they were engaged. And she felt the same thing she had felt then, the specific rightness of having found the person who was meant to stand beside you, not because the world arranged it, or because it was convenient, or because either of them had been looking for rescue, but because they had both been honest enough and brave enough and stubborn enough to recognize the truth when it arrived, and to keep choosing it every day after. The truth was this. Ida Callahan had ridden 60 miles through a mountain pass in the October dark to save her land, and she had done it because the land was worth saving, and because she was a woman who did not surrender what she had earned. But she had not ridden alone. She had ridden with George Rhodes, who had saddled his horse in a livery at 8:45 at night without being asked, and ridden beside her through the cold and the dark and the shale passes and the narrow ledges. Not for the railroad, not for the easement, not for any professional obligation that could justify it, but because she had told him what was happening and he had looked at her face and understood immediately that there was nowhere else he was going to be. That was the truest thing she knew about him, and she had known it since that night, and she kept knowing it fresh every day. The land office had registered the deal. The contest had been defeated. The rival's letter had arrived 6 minutes too late, 6 minutes because they had ridden through the night and not stopped, and not lost faith, and not accepted that the thing was lost before it was lost. 6 minutes. The margin of a life's worth of work, held by 6 minutes and 60 miles and 2 people who were going to go home and build something lasting. They did. On the last evening of October in 1882, exactly 4 years after the night they had ridden north through the mountains, Ida stood on the porch of the house her father had built and watched the sun go down behind the western ridge, painting the sky in layers of orange and rose and deep blue. Inside the house, Clara was making the specific noise she made when she was fighting sleep but losing, and Patrick's voice was carrying on a careful, earnest conversation with someone, possibly his father, possibly one of the barn cats. Both were equally plausible. The kitchen smelled of the supper she had just finished cooking. George came out and stood beside her, 2 cups of coffee in hand, and gave her one. She took it. The ridge was going dark, the colors deepening and fading. 4 years, she said. 4 years, he agreed. A great deal has happened in 4 years. A remarkable amount, he said. She looked at the creek below, still running, clear and constant, the way it had run through every season of her life on this land. The pumping station sat quiet on the east bank. The cattle were settled for the evening in the upper pastures. The garden was done for the season, but the ground was already thinking about spring. I would do it again, she said. All of it. George looked at her. The 60 miles in the dark, all of it, she said. Every minute. He put his arm around her and she settled into his side, and they stood on the porch in the last light of October, 4 years from the night that had changed everything, and the creek ran below them and the mountain stood above them and the house behind them was warm and full of life, and Ida Callahan looked out at her land, her father's land, her children's land, and thought, "It is mine. It has always been mine, and I kept it. I kept it and it kept me, and now there is all of this besides." The stars came out above the mountains. The porch light burned steady. Inside, Clara stopped fighting sleep and Patrick's voice went quiet, and the only sound was the creek and the wind in the pines and the soft, constant breath of the land that held them all.